In this video, I'm going to better explain how to dimension and pick the steel for your cutter. The length of the cutter is determined by the diameter of your tap's dowel. So for my tap, the diameter is 3/4 of an inch. So I made my cutter at a total length of about a 1/16 less than that. You want the cutter as long as you can get it without sticking past the sides of the dowel. Otherwise, when you're starting to tap a nut and the cutter is only sticking out just a 1/16 or less, you don't want the back of the cutter sticking out and scraping inside the hole you're tapping. The width of the cutter is determined by the number of teeth per inch you have. So basically, if you look at your tap, the distance between the curves. And for my 4 tooth per inch tap, the distance is a quarter of an inch, so that was the width of my cutter. If you look back at the first part in the series, I explain how to dimension and pick the number of teeth per inch you want for your tap, and how to dimension the diameter of your tap as well. The thickness of the steel that you use for your cutter is not as relevant as these dimensions are. I would not go too far under 1/8 of an inch thick, just because the cutter could vibrate during the cut, and since most of the tapping is cutting on end grain, on short grain, there's a lot of pressure, so I'm sure if you use thinner steel than 1/8 of an inch, it might chatter a little more, but you don't really need to go any higher than 1/8 of an inch. If you're doing a tap that's much larger, maybe a 4-inch diameter, or something like over 1 tooth per inch, you might want to use thicker steel, but you don't need to for most wooden screws that you'll probably be making. In this picture, you can see the diameter of the dowel with the cutter highlighted right here. You can also see I've drawn that bevel on the cutter as well, which is that 15 degrees that I had shown in part 4. If you do use a thicker steel to make your cutter with, like radically thicker, like if it was maybe that thick, you may need to use a sharper angle. Otherwise, the back of the cutter might dig into the wall of the nut, into the inside of the nut. So that's really all that bevel is for, is just to relieve the back of the cutter from digging into the inside of the nut. Here's the cutter that I've just made. This is a cutter that I made before for a 2 tooth per inch tap. So if you do plan on making more than one tap, either ones of different diameters or different numbers of teeth per inch, you will have to make separate cutters for each tap, because the length of the cutter is custom to the diameter of the dowel, and the width is custom to the number of teeth per inch that you have. When picking the steel for your cutter, it doesn't have to be tool steel like I used for this one. You can use an old file, which is what I used for this cutter. The only downside to using a file is that you have to soften it beforehand, and you have to use a coarse sharpening stone to get rid of the file marks on the cutting face. When picking the material for your cutter, it's not necessary to use tool steel like I just did. Using an old file will hold an edge just as well. I've used this cutter, which was made from an old file, to cut through hard maple about 4 inches thick, and it could still probably have tapped another nut, though I do usually hone the blade in between tapping nuts. If anyone has any further questions, just leave a comment on any one of the videos and I'll try to get back. Whenever I get many of the same question, I'll continue to put out supplementary videos like this one to provide further details into the construction of the tap and the screw jig that's to come.